The Franco-Flemish War of the early 14th century is not very well known, but some of you might have heard of the Battle of the Golden Spurs, which took part during that war, and many people say that this battle marked the beginning of the preference of infantry over cavalry in Western Europe, and today the battle is an important symbol of Flemish nationalism. The Flemish won the battle, but they lost the war, and in 1305 they were made a fiefdom of France once again. But just 10 years later, Robert III rebelled against the French, so Louis X marched an army on Flanders. However, Flanders was saved thanks to torrential rain stopping Louis's army in its track. But this torrential rain continued more or less for about 2 years and caused crop failures and the Great Famine of 1315. Now, the rains affected other military campaigns as well. For instance, Robert the Bruce's brother was campaigning in Ireland, but the Scottish armies were unable to feed themselves once the rain started, so they had to retreat. But the famine had a huge impact on social life in Europe. Now, of course, this wasn't the first famine to strike Europe, but it was so long and so deadly that people began to see it as a curse from God. And one English poet said that it was because the world was too overproud. And as people grew desperate for food, there were reports of people eating horses, cats and dogs, and the occasional reports of cannibalism. For instance, in Germany and here in the Low Countries, it is said that gangs of criminals used to go city to city and eat the flesh of prisoners who were in the gallows. And there are also stories of infanticide and child abandonment. For instance, this seems like the period that inspired the story of Hansel and Gretel. And now take this with a little bit of a pinch of salt. There seems to have been a crime wave across Europe. Well, first off, I should say that it hit urban centres particularly hard, and here in the Low Countries, a lot of the cities lost around 5 to 10% of the population, marking the end of a couple centuries long population growth, and it weakened the whole population before the Black Death. But it does seem that the world became slightly more dangerous during this time. For instance, in Norwich Castle in England, about 46 people on average were tried every single day, and sometimes this number rose to about 71, and historians have found similar trends right across Europe. Plus, interestingly, this seems to be the only time in history that women committed over 10% of the crimes. And homicide rates in cities like Oxford rose to about 100 per 100,000, and you had the outbreak of extended wars like the 100 Years' War, and homicide rates just across the border in the Netherlands wouldn't drop again until the mid-15th century, and this seems to be pretty much the same right across Europe once again. Many, by the way, put the drop in homicide rates in the middle of the 14th century in Netherlands down to the increase in state powers at that time. But whether or not you think the 14th century was more dangerous than the 12th century is up for debate.